Welcome to the online course Essentials of Youth Policy, organised by the partnership between the European Commission and the Council of Europe in the field of youth.
Welcome everyone to the third webinar titled as Future Trends in Youth Policy, What's Upcoming, which is actually part of the Mooc, Essentials of Youth Policy, organized by the partnership between European Commission and Council of Europe in the field of youth. My name is Ron Salai and I will be facilitating this webinar. Together with me will be also Laimonas, my colleague, who will support me with collecting questions from Zoom, from the webinar space, and also from the Facebook page of the partnership. So we have also two guests with us. Colleen Robinson, who is doing real-time graphic recording and providing us a fantastic visual summary of the webinar, and also Professor Gary Pollock, the guest speaker of the webinar, whom I will introduce shortly. So I mentioned the title of this webinar is Future Trends in Youth Policy, and we're gonna try to explore together current and upcoming issues which are relevant in young people's lives and should be part of youth policy in the future. I would like, before I introduce Gary, I would like to make briefly two announcements. First, the webinar is being live streamed on Facebook, so everyone who is watching us and would like to get involved in the webinar, they can do it by sending us questions on Facebook page, but also on Zoom here, there is a question and answer button just down. You can see, and you can use that space to address your questions to the speaker. And the second announcement I would like to make, which is an important one, is related to the Mooc. Everyone who is interested to sign up in Mooc Essentials for Youth Policy is more than welcomed. The enrollment is still open, and we'd welcome to join any interested candidate on the Mooc. Before passing over the word to Gary, I would like to introduce Gary very briefly. Professor Gary Pollock is head of the Department of Sociology at Manchester Metropolitan University. He was coordinator of the FP7My web project, which established the feasibility of a Europe-wide longitudinal survey of child and young people's well-being. Gary was also co-initiator of the FP7My Place project, which was a multi-method project exploring young people and politics across Europe. Between 1995 and 2009, he was also founder member and deputy coordinator of the European Sociological Association Youth and Generation Research Network. That is very brief introduction, so you can have also a general picture of Gary. And I now pass over to you, Gary, please.
Thank you very much, Ron, and thank you very much everyone else for joining us. I'm very pleased to be able to speak to you all about my thoughts, and I'm very interested in hearing what your thoughts are as well. I have a PowerPoint presentation which I shall share in a moment, and then which I shall go through, and that will form the structure of what I shall be talking about here. But I should also say at the outset that this session that I'm facilitating here, or that I'm running here, it's really trying to get you to think about the future, and it's pretty light when it comes to data and references, and it's heavy when it comes to trying to think about the future, thinking about what contemporary challenges are and what the future challenges are that we need to be thinking about as people interested in both research and policy, but more on that later. Okay, so I'm just about to share with you my PowerPoint, which I hope is now visible.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. So, future trends in youth research and policy, as Ron said, because actually I am very much interested in policy. So the overview of the talk is I'm going to be speaking under three main headings: marginalization and inequality, power and politics, and values and citizenship. So I've got something to say about each of those three topic areas, where I think about what the current challenges are, and then go on to ask questions and conjecture about what the future agendas maybe should be. So, as Ron said, I'm a professor of sociology at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. I work within what's known as the Policy Evaluation and Research Unit, and that's quite important, I think. So the research unit that I'm based in is very much to do with the development of policies and the evaluation of policies. So it's not simply pure research that we're undertaking, basic research. There is a very much an applied core to what we do. And you can see the website, I've listed the website there, which if you look at it, you will see that youth transitions is one of the key areas that we do work on within the Policy Evaluation Research Unit, or Peru as we call it for short. Okay, so youth. I've been doing youth research for many years now, and in some respects, the questions have remained fairly constant. And you know, for me, the main question is all about the opportunity and structures that youth face, and the ways in which we think about young people in society, the opportunities they've got in front of them, and the ways in which they've got the ability to negotiate these structures, and the way they've got resources which help them to navigate their life journey. Now, life journey is a very important concept for me, because I think that all too often research projects are focused on single issues which are fixed in a moment in time. And actually what my perspective is very much geared towards thinking about young people, their lives, and how their lives unfold. So, you know, things happen through time, and so there's a longitudinal component to pretty much everything that I'm interested in. So, related to this main question about opportunity structures and how people negotiate their life, their own life project, I've listed these 4 other questions which I feel are related. They contribute to our understanding of this the position of young people in society. So how do we, and we as researchers, as policymakers, as practitioners, how do we go about reducing the chances that young people get left behind? How can we support young people to embrace the challenges of life positively? How do we ensure that young people develop sense of their own personal value, and how can we avoid alienating young people from a positive future? So these questions, I think, help us also unpack that main question about opportunities and structures. Now, what this is also getting at is the way in which we think about society in general. So, of course, there are structures in society. We live our lives through certain structuring elements, such as the education system, the employment system, the governance of any particular area we live in, the local area, the nation state, and so forth. But within that, of course, we've got some power to do things ourselves, to make changes. So there are structures, and there is individual agency, as it's called. And I think that it's important for us to think about this dynamic of how the structures are there to facilitate things that we do, or maybe limit things that we do, and the extent to which the agency that we've got actually can be something which can overcome limitations which many people might face. So linking to that is an understanding that when we're looking at any particular issue in society, we can think of it as having both macro and micro elements. So if we think about the transition from school to work, we can think about the macro element there as being national educational structures, the systems and structures that people have to go through within any country to get qualified, and then to ultimately, hopefully, get a job. So there's a macro element there, but also we've got to think about the micro element. So the fact that, of course, young people are negotiating these trajectories from education to work, and they're often very much rooted in personal experiences, experiences to do with our identity. And so we've got to think about the micro elements and the ways in which these young people from different backgrounds actually negotiate these trajectories. And maybe more and more we should be thinking about the micro issues. And I've listed some important identity-related factors there in relation to the micro. Okay. Briefly then, evidence and policy. Okay, I'm a researcher. I'm a researcher who's interested in evidence-based policy making, or at least evidence-informed policy making, without being naive about the political processes by which evidence is used and policies are developed. Without doubt, in my view, there is a need for there to be high quality evidence to inform policy making, whether or not that actually gets used by the policymakers. So all research designs ought to have at the core of it an interest in actually generating high quality data which can be taken forward and used within policy processes. And as I've said there, this webinar is aiming to raise questions, speculative questions as to what the future might hold for young people, and ultimately to think about the extent to which we can help young people to be masters of their own fate, how we can facilitate that agency, which I think is important for young people. Okay, now I'm going to be presenting you with a number of conjectures, and what I want you to be doing is actively thinking about and listening to what I'm suggesting. So obviously you may agree with what I say, you may disagree. So what is your view of the conjecture that I'm putting forward? How does this conjecture apply within your own field of experience? And what perhaps am I missing? What conjecture have I missed completely, or what should be adapted within what I'm saying to inform a future research and policy agenda? So active listening on your part. Okay, on to the main themes then. So first of all, marginalization and inequality. Pretty much most of the work I do has got a marginalization and inequality angle associated with it. And to some extent, you could say that maybe the whole of social science is about looking at inequalities, structured inequalities across society. In particular, current challenges to do with marginalization and inequality, they link to the perennial marginalization of young people. In terms of the labour market, they tend to be in the worst position. They're the last in, the first out, the lowest paid. There are issues to do with the stratification of employment by social class, the ways in which young people going through education are labelled, and that their social background maybe holds them back. So the perennial marginalization of young people. Moving on, growing inequalities, often geographic, still clustered based on socioeconomic categories. So, inequality has been around for a long time. How much are we actually managing to make a difference? Which countries are managing to make a difference? We know, for example, that the Nordic countries have this reputation of being less unequal than many other countries. And how is that? How are they managing to do that? What are the policy levers that they're using to do that? And why is it in other countries inequality seems to be increasing? And finally, the need for targeted interventions in evidence-based policy making. It is important that interventions are made, that we know exactly who needs these interventions, and it's only good quality evidence that can give us that. Okay, so in terms of the future, marginalization and inequality, one conjecture I have is that the hypothesized mismatch between skills which are taught in schools and colleges will continue to be an issue for industry and commerce. So this is something that we hear often, which is that that businesses say that the young people coming through the education system don't possess the skills which are required in the modern day labour market. And it's been mentioned many times over the years, over the decades, and I suspect that this is something which will not go away. However much education systems are developed, this mismatch will be asserted by employers. And of course, there are questions there that we might have as to the extent to which employers could do something themselves about this and actually engage with educational institutions. And so we can think about which countries might have a tradition of doing that. Germany in particular, which has got the reputation of where employers tend to get more involved in educational structures than they do certainly in the UK. So the hypothesized failure then of educational institutions to deliver into the labour market what is required. Secondly, in terms of employment, is the embedding. I feel that there is going to be an embedding of what is often known as the gig economy. These are low quality jobs which young people are getting, often end on end. These jobs some of them may require qualifications. Often it's low level employment. And ultimately, this is leading towards the inability to develop what might be regarded as a proper career. Sometimes this is known as a portfolio of jobs or portfolio career, but that's maybe putting a positive gloss on something which is actually not really that positive. Maybe it's better understood as linking to debates on precarity and the precarious situation that young people often find themselves in and the ways in which their employment trajectories are broken. So I suspect that this gig economy will become an embedded feature of the future, and it's something which we need to think about more. Who's affected by it? Who's suffering most by it? And what needs to be done to maybe to prevent that from happening? Third conjecture in relation to marginalization and inequality relates to independence. And we're seeing increasingly that young people are more and more dependent on the family, often the extended family. So this is often to do with debt. It can be to do with the availability of housing as well. But what seems to be happening is that the family is becoming more important as a resource, whereas in the past, in decades gone past, young people were able to become more independent quicker than they are currently. So housing, family, low wages, all reasons as to why young people are becoming more likely to be dependent on the family and less independent, the delay of their own independence. Family rearing as well is another factor there, of course. It is the case that young people are delaying having children, and that often links to resources to do with pay, housing and independence. And finally, in relation to marginalization and inequality is health, because what we're seeing is that the generation of young people growing up now are potentially going to be less healthy than their parents. This is something which has been a surprise and which is maybe quite shocking. It should be shocking for us, thinking that as society develops, that actually health is starting to help. The health of young people is reversing in relation to the health of their parents. And so, why is that? What should we be doing? What we should be linking our research projects to work out why this is the case. Now, of course, we know that there are issues to do with food consumption, sedentary lifestyles, obesity. And yet, on the other hand, we also know that young people tend to be turning away from smoking, alcohol consumption, and so and yet they're not balancing. And then perhaps one of the biggest increases in health issues at the moment across Europe is in relation to mental health problems, and questions are being posed in relation to the increase in mental health. Why is that? Is it to do, for example, with the ways in which young people are communicating with each other through social media and engaging with social media? This is a conjecture which has been put forward. Whatever the answers are, without doubt, there is a wave, an increasing wave of mental health issues which need to be faced, thought about. Okay. in relation to resources about how you can find out more about what's going on in relation to marginalization and inequality, two projects. There are European funded projects. One is the STYLE project. I've got the URL there, and the ACCEPT project. Both of these projects have got a focus on socioeconomic inequality. And if you want to find out more about about some of these issues, then have a look at those. Okay, moving on to power and politics then. Current challenges. It's interesting. Okay, so power and politics, here we are. Maybe some of you have been looking at the results of the American election, and there is clearly a gendered element to what's going on in America there. More women, congresswomen being elected than ever before, but there's also a youth-related angle as well. So a lot of mobilization of young people, because we know that politics is often demographically structured. Such is the case certainly across Europe. And when we look at, for example, the Brexit vote in the UK, that was definitely demographically structured, with older people tended to be more pro-Brexit and young people pro-Remain. Okay, so the questions here are to do with young people and access to power, and things to do with participation. How is it that young people are associating with politics and power? And how should we be thinking about facilitating different ways in which they're doing that? And what is the role? What is the role of young people within political structures? Okay, so here a number of conjectures then. And the first one is to do with social media, and it does relate to what we have been observing over the past couple of years in relation to the ways in which Facebook in particular, but other forms of social media have been accused of being a tool for people who are seeking to influence the way in which people vote. So the whole fake news thing that Donald Trump is very interested in talking about, how do we broach that as researchers when it is possibly the case that the plausibility of a story, it might be as important as the credibility of the source? How do we talk to young people and get them thinking about credibility, about issues to do with about the accuracy of information, and how is that going to play itself out when it comes to future young people's engagement with politics? Because there is this idea that young people are potentially vulnerable to populist discourse. So let's move on. Oh, I think I may have I've missed. I wanted to go back to this one: identity-related political issues. Now, without doubt, identity politics it's been there. It's always been there to some extent. It's been mobilised now in a different sort of way, often in relation to populist discourses. So what we are seeing often is what is known as nativism or nationalism, related to patriotism, and so it's this the identity-based politics of belonging is often linked to populist discourses, looking at people and their difference, and it's what is interesting here is that while we're seeing the rise of identity-related politics, is it that we are also at the same time seeing the decline of what we could have regarded as socioeconomic politics, and the ideological strands of politics which were linked to inequality and so forth. In relation to young people and politics, my view is that we will always have to understand that young people will be at the vanguard of political issues, and that this is a very positive thing. So that and it goes back to this idea that that there is a big demographic split between young and old when it comes to how people are voting and what their views are. And so when there are issues like the wave of populism across Europe, the Brexit vote, what's going on in America with Trump and the Republicans and the way the Republican Party seems to have changed. It's often spoken that young people will be it's the generational shift, and that the young people and their participation in demonstration and occupations and mobilizing themselves, that's what will count, and that will be the future. And in relation to resources on power and politics, as Ron mentioned earlier, I was keenly involved in the My Place project, link of which is there. There's lots of resources there. And I've also linked, got a link here to a paper which I co-authored, which is linked to the Youth Partnership, the European Union Council of Youth Partnership. So the link of that is there as well. You can have a look at it. Much of what I'm talking about today as its origins in that paper. And then finally, values and citizenship. So, not, of course, completely unrelated to politics in many ways, citizenship and values, but broadening things out a little bit more and thinking about young people and how they view society and their role as a citizen within society. And here, what I'm interested in particular are the ways in which their citizenship is facilitated by educational practices. And so what we've got are national curricula, ways in which young people are taught, and they're taught about who they are in society from a particular, in their society within a social, historical and cultural perspective. And so that's always been the case. And I guess it always will be the case, but it's thinking about how that actually is manifest and how that might be something which we regard as positive or something which is potentially problematic. So there's formal educational practices. Of course, there's always informal educational practices as well, the way we learn from experience and through our family and so forth. And then there's citizenship education, and then democracy and citizenship. So what I'm getting at here is that to some extent, political and citizenship questions are related, and that some of these are under threat in relation to populist perspectives. So, first conjecture then in relation to values and citizenship, it's to do with how we ensure that we reach everybody. So there are young people who are vulnerable, marginal, and they are potentially people who can be captured by extreme ideologies, radical ideologies, and maybe less likely to be focused on mainstream issues. And so it's important to think about the ways in which young people might be drawn into particular political discourses or maybe excluded from mainstream discourses. And so it is important to have a focus on hard to reach groups. Secondly, is to do with what have been for many years broadly accepted elements of democracy, tolerance, and the political system, which have been called into question by populist movements. And so we do hear more and more about the ways in which democracy is being questioned as an adequate political tool. And that should maybe frighten people, the extent to which some alternative to democracy might be regarded as a legitimate political system. But it is something which certainly is of interest to Europe and America. And it almost does seem as if the clock is turning back to some extent, and that maybe lessons from history are important when it comes to thinking about why we should worry about the way in which people are being turned away from democracy, tolerance, openness, and so forth. Because in my view, it is the debate is important, difference is important, argument is important, but the the way in which people engage with it and the place where they engage with it it's got to be such that there is some sort of tolerance. You know, not everyone's going to agree with each other, but the place where they disagree with each other has got to be, it's got to exist. And then finally, in relation to values and citizenship, my conjecture is place is going to become ever more important concept. And what I'm getting at here is linking back to the ways in which citizenship, politics, democracy is being ever more understood as something to do with local. And whatever that local might be thought of, you know, it's where you live, your town, your region, a subnational region or a national region. These place-related issues have become more important. I feel that they will become ever more important. So it is some sort of localism, however that localism is understood. Now, in relation to values and citizenships, an interesting project to look at is the Party Space project, another European funded project which looked at cities and youth mobilization and citizenship and politics within those cities. I've pretty much come to the end of what I wanted to say. Some more resources for you to look at. Again, European projects. These European projects, I think, are great places to look at for to see what's happening comparatively across the world. Now, these final two projects are, while they're European funded, they actually include and they are focused on the Mediterranean and the North African regions, so that they actually broaden out some of these issues, taking a broader perspective and looking beyond Europe and looking at the extent to which what we know exists in Europe, whether or not it travels, whether or not our research tools can be used overseas, it's they're interesting resources for you to look at. That is pretty much it from me. And so what I would like to, I think I was down to talk for around about half an hour. I think that is my half an hour. So I think I'd like then to stop sharing and come back onto the video and move on to the questions.
Thank you so much, Gary. Yes, in fact, you were quite on time, in half an hour. And I think you have brought up some very, very interesting points of view. I think there is also quite a lot of space to raise some hard questions out there. And there are a number of fields, from education to health to new forms of economy, to marginalization, inequality, alienation of youth. And I think these are all quite interesting topics to be discussed of. So what I would like to do is just to check about the questions, and then we move forward with them. We have currently now on Zoom 2 questions. The first arrived by Annette Woolley, and you can read it on the button. So, is there any actual research on the future prediction of the mismatch of skills between school and the workplace?
Okay, yes, I can read the question. I'm reading it now. A major employer, please. Yeah. Evidence that prediction would help in lobbying. Okay. Yeah, there is research. I mean, there has been research in the past on the mismatch. There is research within the STYLE project on this, which you could look at. What's particularly interesting here, I think, is the way in which you're saying that you're getting praised by an employer for a particular skills and aptitudes. Here. But okay, so you're saying evidence that prediction would help in lobbying to gain funding or include these programs in schools so they're more accessible and not just available. I think part of the issue here is educationalists and employers have got different agendas. And so what the employer argues is important to them is not necessarily what the educationalist feels important to do within the school. And so, what is important here, I think, is for some sort of partnership, and getting in, rather than having a debate, an unproductive debate between educationalists and employers. It's actually important to try to draw the employers into the educational curriculum development, and ensure that, that there's a partnership there. So that's the perspective I think that would be appropriate. How that is manifest, though, is going to be a real challenge, because in some countries, as I said, Germany, there is more of a tradition of that happening, whereas in many other countries, the educationalists and the employers are less likely to have that sort of dialogue. I feel I've not adequately answered that question, but I can't think of anything else to say for now. Monica, are young people more prone to be under populist ideas in countries in which economies are weaker, and in which therefore they have less opportunities for job search and eventually finding employment? That's a good question. Okay, so when we were doing the My Place project, and we had within that countries all around Europe, included Russia, included Georgia, included Hungary, Slovakia, Greece, UK, Portugal, Spain. So there was a good range of countries within that. And what we did within these countries is we had two research areas in each country, one of which was an area we felt young people were going to more likely to be drawn into radical populist ideas, and the other one, which was a contrasting area where we felt that was less likely. Now, it was the case, of course, that the areas which were economically weaker were areas where young people were more likely to be drawn into populist and radicalized populist politics. So I think that there is evidence that weak economies, lack of jobs, it is something which will potentially facilitate growing levels of populism.
So thank you, Gary. I pasted on chat. So another question that we received on Canvas, which is our Mooc environment. And basically it's Julia who kind of posed this double layer question and asks, what kind of challenges are young people facing or are likely to be facing in the future with all the technological, political, societal changes our world is going through? And also, what should be the topics of phenomena youth policy should look at in the future? I think you touched upon many of the elements that during your intervention. So not sure if you would like to add anything on this.
Yeah, I thought I'd covered some of these, but maybe not well enough. Because yes, I do. To some extent, I think it's too early to tell. So the question is, how does new media technology and social media in particular, what are the long-term effects of that? We just don't know. And in actual fact, the European Commission is at the moment looking to fund projects which will be asking these very questions. It's to do with the speed of technological development to some extent. And it's thinking about the qualitative shifts that young people have been going through. So and the speed at which things have changed, because we only have to turn the clock back 10 years. And we you know, it was a completely different set of technologies that young people were using. Every year there are further developments, new apps, and of course parents find it very difficult to keep up with these things, and to some extent rely on their children to let them know how to use this technology. What I think has been quite interesting is also, however, the way in which the tech companies have been very slow actually in seeing that these are particularly big issues for parents, and issues for societies. So the development of these technologies has gone about with very little regulation. And again, if we think about what had happened since the Trump election of 2016 and the way in which Facebook was clearly attacked by external sources, lack of regulation, lack of understanding, and lack of ways in which people are not thinking about how new technologies can be abused. And so I think that things are now starting to change on that. My evidence is personal evidence that that Apple are now introducing belatedly ways in which you can control not only your own device and your own usage of your device, but other devices associated with them. So I think it's a regulation issue in particular. Because obviously there is going to continue to be change, will develop, but now people are now starting to ask the questions, the right questions. Right.
Yeah,
question.
We have Dina Marinkovic, who is asking, in my experience, youth work is sort of an area where this partnership and dialogue between employers and education system happens. But it's hard being this connection if youth work isn't recognized in your country. Should this be at one of the areas that youth policy in Europe should look at? Basically, maybe creating a European platform for lobbying and recognition of youth work in countries where youth work isn't recognized.
That's an interesting question, because yes, it's very uneven across Europe, the way in which youth policy is manifest. I really don't know. I mean, it always seems like a good idea to have European platforms for lobbying, but actually European platforms can have the opposite effect as well. So we just have to think about the ways in which Europe and the profile, the image, the reputation of Europe and Europe-wide policies can actually be corrosive within certain national contexts. And it could very well be that those national contexts are the ones where there is weakness in the representation of youth policies. So I think that that's a real challenge. Europe, in my view, is a force for good, and it can develop platforms which will effectively lobby. It does do that, but there's no guarantee that it will actually have the positive effect that we would want. Let's think about a recent initiative across Europe, which was the travel initiative, which the European Union rolled out for young people, giving young people, 18-year-olds, the ability to travel around Europe on a rail card. So it is possible for these sorts of initiatives to be successful, but I just would have doubts as to whether that they would be successful in the right places. So I would say that actually national lobbying is going to be equally important to any Europe-wide lobbying.
Thank you, Gary. We have a question by Mark Taylor on chat. So he asks, what is the worst example you have seen of the use of policy-based research rather than evidence-based?
The worst example that I have seen. Well, policy-based, it's more, I mean, I guess the point I'm making is that the policies are ideologically driven as opposed to evidence driven. Well, I can't think off the top of my head. It's a good question. But if we think about educational practices, actually, I can't think of that for now. Sorry, I can come back to that one.
Okay. So for the moment, we don't have other questions, but I think I might address one or two if you have time. Gary, you mentioned in your presentation, but also while addressing the other question about the need and the whole challenge about regulating social media, but not only the internet as well. This is a topic it's also close to my work, and it's not only the need to regulate the social media, but also the understanding of the whole internet infrastructure. You know, the surveillance has been a big problem, the privacy of users, terms of conditions. So how many, how young people understands the terms of condition, the use of social media, the whole, the bubble that exists within different environments on social media, and so on. We have seen also positive development, like for example, Germany with the approval of the new law on trying to regulate the media, which was heavily criticized as some sort of restriction to the freedom of expression. And this sort of border between, you know, regulating the social media and not also violating the others of freedom of expression has been very controversial at the same time. So while there is sort of a need to sort of regulate this, the entire sort of internet and social media and the whole infrastructures behind it, do you think that here education can play also an important role? And I mean here education in the sense of internet and media literacy, and introducing this informal and non-formal curriculum in the formal education and non-formal education, and trying to work with the younger generation and how you understand the internet and how that sort of affects the daily lives of the young people.
That's a great question, a very detailed question as well, I should say. And I think that within it, of course, there can be no single answer. So it's this issue of freedom and regulation, isn't it? So that the internet has been pretty much free and unregulated up till now, and now we realise that that regulation is important. And not just regulation, but actually better understandings of what the internet is, what it has become, and how it can be, how it ought to be used. I agree that that there is a need for education, particularly formal education, to take a role in this. And I do think that it's happening. It is certainly happening in some curricula where there has been a development of, you know, what one time was called computing. It became information technology. It probably is still called information technology, ICT, and so forth, but it's changing. So it's less to do with a benign understanding of how these technologies are used, and much more to do with an understanding of what they are capable of, and therefore how we need to think about how we use them. But as I said in an earlier answer, I really think we're at very early stages there, and we don't know enough. So we don't know enough about how young people are using them and how they're vulnerable to them, and what the long-term effects might be of quantities of use, as well as the quality of things which they're maybe not doing because of the ways in which the internet and social media has exploded and is taking so much time. So I think that there's a lot of questions in there, and I would say that there's a need for us to understand more about what these levels of usage are before we start to really know how we can address them and what the right policies should be. Now, what we've got, of course, are people growing up, using these technologies at different points in their lives, and so there's a dynamic here which we'll never really fully be able to get on top of. So if you're 18 now, and you're a social media user, you've come into it at a different time, who's maybe age 30, obviously age 13, and so the routinization of the use of social media for the younger person is it happened at an earlier age, and that itself will have an effect. So So again, coming back to this, the interest I've got in longitudinal dynamic processes, you know, it's always going to be the case that younger and younger people are getting involved in these things. And so we're always, as researchers and policymakers, always playing catch up and not really fully understanding what the longer term effects would be. But without doubt, coming back to your question, which has got the answer, I think, implicitly within it, educationally, we need to be doing more. We need to be thinking more around these issues to do with freedom, to do with regulation, to do with privacy, surveillance, and so forth. And young people need to be they need to be aware of them so that they've got the kind of resources that they need to have to be in control. Because I guess, I mean, turning things full circle, you know, and where I came in with the talk, it does sometimes seem to be the case that with these technologies, that young people are sort of losing control. Is it that they are, that technology at one time seemed to be an enabler, and now actually things have reversed, and that we are being controlled by the technology? So how can young people be, how can we facilitate a more, a use of these sorts of technology where young people have got the upper hand and they can do it on their terms, and aren't being sucked into something which maybe they don't realize is taking over aspects of their life.
Thanks, Terry. It looks like other questions are popping up.
Okay.
We have Andrea Ducan, who would like to go back to the field of gig economy that you emphasized in your presentation. So his question is, what can we do to help and create real life impact to help young adults who are currently unemployed but have the skills necessary and studies but are unable to hit their potential, reach the starting point of their career? This is a very big concern to nowadays society, as I believe it has become ever more connected with the prevalence of mental health problems.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Okay, so the answer to this is partly to do with expectations. And realism within expectations, because it would be a cruel deceit for us to be saying to young people that they are able to succeed, you know, in the ways that that they might want to. We've got to manage their expectations to some extent. That's one side of the equation, I think. So managing expectations and ensuring that, that there's a certain realism that young people have, while on the other side, actually building resources for young people so that they're able to cope with the complexities of the contemporary labour market. So, and these things to some extent go together. So if there's an expectation that there are going to be a series of gig economy type jobs in their life, particularly at the early part of their life, and they've got to think about how they manage that, maybe doing multiple jobs in parallel, a relatively low level. How are they going to manage that, and how are they going to do it in such a way that they can have a longer term goal which is achievable, which will get them beyond this, in the hope that that's what they want to do. So as with many education to employment transition, it is about building up some sort of experiential base, and it's building up maybe some qualifications as well, and so it's that process of building up the CV, building up that body of experience, and how that can be used to protect people in the future. Now, the question links it to mental health problems. It could be connected. I was thinking more in gig economy, more in terms of a structured career trajectory. But I don't doubt that there are people who will suffer mental health for not being able to achieve a robust and stable career.
Yeah, in fact, I think the question is also very interconnected with other topics as well. You know, the the topic of privatization of education, which, you know, the young people needs now to get the new loans, and then that loans need to be returned, and then they have to get a job while studying, and that puts a lot of pressures to the shoulder of the young people at their very early age, and so on, the working conditions and so on and so forth. So I think there is sort of very interconnection between different things that you have touched upon during your presentation.
Sure. Sure.
We have probably time for another question. Amanda Milan is asking, in my country, youth workers are not recognized professionals as well. At the same time, they play an essential role in implementing youth policies in a country where there is not even a national youth policy framework. How can they be prepared to read these new challenges? What is their role in facing those issues?
Okay, so this is a political issue, a political and lobbying issue. So while youth workers may not be recognized professionals, obviously there will be professionals who are recognized and who have got the ability to undertake political lobbying. And so what the youth professionals need to do is to somehow align themselves with alternative structures which will influence policymakers and politicians. So it's all about building these alliances. So if it's not going to be youth policy, then it's got to be with whomever. You know, is it the educationalists? Is it people supporting voluntary work or employer organisations? The youth workers have got to somehow align themselves to these other structures in society which are able to undertake effective political lobbying. So it's about pressure groups. It's about maybe trade unions is another one as well. It's about developing links, because I suspect that if there is not in a country where there is not a history, a culture of youth work being linked to these sorts of political discourses, it's unlikely to change quickly. So you've got to be doing it along with and alongside those structures where it already does exist.
Great. So it looks like this was the last question.
Yeah. We have one more from the chat.
Okay.
Ahmed Al Mokadem was asking about what about the involvement of young people outside of EU into EU youth programs, because then apparently in many neighboring regions there is a lack of opportunities for young people to be involved.
And that's to do with EU programs, let's say, for example, like Erasmus.
Yeah, which already has some involvement. I mean, organizations can be partners with organizations from the EU countries, and they can cooperate. So I was not sure if Ahmed is asking if there should be a bigger engagement of young people from neighboring regions, or bigger, more resources.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I think the EU is interested in involving young people outside of Europe. I mean, of course, the European Union has got this understanding of that it's important to be working along with neighbouring countries, but also not just neighbouring countries of the European Union, but countries beyond the neighbouring countries as well. So, and of course, this is partly related to issues to do with migration and the way that people are coming into the European Union from the outside, but also to do with actually global politics and stability, because obviously the European Union wants to be within a stable environment, and so it will actually undertake programs with these other countries where that's going to facilitate political stability. So the two projects that I mentioned right at the end, the Sahwa project and the Power to Youth project, they're both undertaken in Africa and Southeast Mediterranean countries, and they're funded by the European Union. They were research projects which probably will have some sort of policy consequences, but but maybe not completely related to programs themselves. But as you say, Lamonis, I think that the European Union is interested. Maybe there is scope actually to develop more integration of youth outside the EU within EU programs. That's a good question.
Thank you, Gary. Unfortunately, we arrived at the end of the webinar. We cannot take any more questions. But again, thanks everyone for participating and watching over via Facebook page. It was, I believe, very, very interesting discussion on some very relevant and contemporary topics. I would like to thank Gary as well for his time and intervention, and everyone who watched. Also thanks to Colleen for this fantastic visualization of the discussion. We will share all the materials, video recording, graphic slides in Canvas course environment, discussion 6.3, and please continue to engage with the topic of the webinar in the course environment. I would like also, before saying goodbye to everyone, I would like again to specify that everyone who is interested to enroll in the Mooc Essentials for Youth Policy can do it until 8 November, so still 1.5 days more. So please enroll in the Mooc if you would like to engage with the topic of youth policy. Thanks again, and we see each other again next time. Bye.
Thank you, Ron.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
We hope this video contributed to your learning about youth policy.